So I think we'll get started. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Liz Brendage. I direct the Avon Global Center for Women in Justice in the Global Gender Justice Clinic here at Cornell. And we're so excited this semester to be partnering with Advocacy Center of Tompkins County on a project that's seeking to promote the recognition of freedom from domestic violence as a fundamental human right. And so I am delighted to be joined by our team, Josh Baldwin, Joanne Joseph, Carolyn Matos Montes, and Kristi Taylor from the Advocacy Center, who are going to tell us a bit about their project and some of the underlying ideas behind it. And we also have at the back a petition if you all would like to sign it, which they can tell you a bit more about as well. So thank you all for coming.
Hi everyone, my name is Carolyn and I'm a third year and I'm also a member of the Global Gender Justice Clinic at Cornell. And we as a team, together with the Avon Center for Women in Justice as well as the Advocacy Center of Ithaca, we are drafting a resolution that declares freedom from domestic violence a fundamental human right. And this is important because it makes what's typically viewed as a private issue a public issue as well, and a public concern. And domestic violence is an issue that is both local and global and affects women and men all over the world. 1 in 3 women in the world will experience some sort of domestic violence, whether it be assault, rape, or other forms of domestic violence. And women are more likely to experience domestic violence than be diagnosed with cancer, malaria, or experience a car accident or a war, which is really, really startling. But domestic violence isn't only a women's issue, it's also a men's issue and affects men as well. 1.3 million women in the US and 835,000 men experience some sort of domestic violence by an intimate partner. And in New York State, I believe 87 men and women died last year as a result of intimate partner homicide. Domestic violence is also a seriously underreported crime because victims may be afraid to report it to the police and are afraid of the consequences that reporting such an issue might create. Domestic violence also has adverse consequences on more than just the survivors of domestic violence themselves. Children might be affected, their intellectual growth might be stunted, and also children are more likely to experience domestic violence later on in their lives or abuse their partners later on in life if they witnessed domestic violence in their youth. And then some of the consequences survivors might experience include serious physical or mental consequences, and the state might also experience loss of productivity in that many days of work might be lost because the survivors might be recovering.
Sure. My name is Josh Baldwin. I'm as well here. You might be wondering why we need to reframe this as a human rights issue. An example would be the story of Jessica Linehan. In 1999, she obtained a restraining order against her abusive ex-husband for her and her 3 children. In June of that year, her ex-husband kidnapped her 3 children. She called the police multiple times. She provided a copy of the restraining order. She asked and pleaded for help. Please find my kids. The police were like, well, just wait, see if your ex-husband brings his children home. It'll all be okay. So she called multiple times throughout the night. She went down to the police station, pleaded for help, and the police still did nothing. Later that night, her ex-husband went to the police station and started a gunfight with the officers. After he was killed in the gunfight, the police went out to his truck and found the bodies of her 3 children. She decided to sue the town of Castle Rock, Colorado, for failing to enforce the restraining order against her for violating her due process rights. This case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where they decided because she didn't have a property interest in the enforcement of this restraining order, that her rights weren't violated at all. So the cops did nothing to protect her children, did nothing to look for them, didn't enforce this restraining order, but her rights somehow weren't violated. She took her case studies to the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. They did the exact same thing, but looking at it from a human rights perspective, they found obviously that her rights were violated. They found that the cops had failed to enforce the restraining orders and that justice had not been done. More recently, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the case of Ray Rice. If you're not, he's an NFL player who punched his fiance, knocked her out in an elevator, and the NFL decided to suspend him for 2 games. Now, that's a good punishment. 2 games, it's fine, it's alright. And only until the video of this incident was released was there any public outcry, any outcry from the media. Once people actually saw how violent an NFL player hitting his fiance so hard it knocks her out, only until then were people like, maybe 2 games isn't quite enough. Maybe that's not good enough. So they decided to suspend him indefinitely. And while the NFL clearly did handle this issue correctly, it was only until everyone else saw the video too that they were outraged. So the NFL wasn't outraged, but neither were the public. So reframing this issue, the human rights issue, it brings more gravity to the situation. It stresses how important this is for people to get justice.
So my name is Joanne Joseph. I'm a third-year student here, and I will be sort of bringing together what Cara talked about the situation of domestic violence in New York State, and what Josh talked about the importance of reframing it as a human rights issue. So far in the last 3 years, there's been a national momentum of local communities banding together to recognize that freedom from domestic violence is a fundamental human right. In September of 2014, only a few months ago, President Obama issued a presidential proclamation saying that freedom from violence and abuse is a human right. So that's something that's recognized on a national level. And since then, since 2011, 12 communities from Washington, D.C. to even Albany, New York, all have passed resolutions recognizing that freedom from domestic violence is a human right. The exciting thing is, if we get Tompkins County to be the 13th, they'll be a New York State leader because they'll be the first rural town to pass, or city to pass a similar resolution, only the second in New York State. So this is really an opportunity for Tompkins County to be a leader in the national movement. There are also a lot of symbolic and practical benefits to passing this resolution. Symbolically, it's a sign of support, of government support to survivors of domestic violence. And we're very carefully using the word survivor as opposed to victim, because we believe that these are people who can be empowered and that they can be supported, and that they're not just defined by what happened to them, but that they can move beyond that. And that the government signing this resolution would confirm that it's not just a private matter or a private issue in their own lives, but it's something that the government has an obligation to help protect, which is really important. It's what Cara was saying about removing this issue from the private realm where no one talks about it, it's very taboo, and saying that it's a societal problem that requires a societal solution. And in saying that, we're not saying it's just the government's responsibility either. We're saying that the government and the community should be hand in hand in a partnership trying to ensure that domestic violence survivors' voices are also part of the process. Because we don't want to assume that we also know what domestic violence survivors need, or what they want, or what their rights require. So we want them also to be part of the conversation. Another thing is that practically, it provides a uniform approach to domestic violence. Tompkins County has a pretty good track record. It's not the worst community out there, but at the same time, individual service providers have individual perspectives on domestic violence, like the Kristi Taylor case. They might have realized that the domestic violence situation required immediate response and required immediate action. But if the government had one resolution or one proclamation to point to say, well, the legislature said that freedom from domestic violence is a human right and we must act accordingly, that puts everyone on the same page. It protects survivors. It makes sure that all of the different parts of the government work together, which is a really exciting proposition, I think, for something as confusing and complex as domestic violence can be. Another thing is that it shows that there is a government responsibility to protect, so this is just the first step in the process. This is a building block that the government can move to. For example, if a another case comes before Tompkins County Court of Domestic Violence. That court can then look at this resolution to say, well, the government has already acknowledged that freedom from domestic violence is a human right. And we know that if there's a right, there's therefore an obligation attached to it. So therefore, it must take some steps to protect survivors, to make sure that everyone is on the same page with understanding that this isn't just a private issue. We're really excited about the fact that Tompkins County is poised, like I said, to be a national leader. We're hoping on bringing this resolution that we've worked on as a clinic for the Tompkins County legislature, and we're planning to do that in November. And we hope to find champions in the legislature who will support our cause and bring it forward. As I've said, this is just the first step of many steps, but we think it's a very important first step. We've also done a lot of community outreach, which has been, I think, a very exciting part of our clinic experience. For example, you may have seen that we published op-ed, sort of wrote a column in the Cornell Daily Sun, which was a really cool experience to figure out how to break down a very legal issue to something that everyone can understand and relate to. We did a lot of tabling events at Cornell. We have a photo campaign where people hold up whiteboard signs and say, domestic violence, freedom from domestic violence is a human right because. And it's been really great to see the community response. We've gone into Ithaca as well as Cornell. We're also planning on being featured on a radio talk show, which is going to be exciting. We're getting media training and everything, so that'll be a good experience. So watch out for that. And we are also planning, like I said, to go to the legislature and advocate there on a local level. Domestic violence is a sort of tricky problem, and here in Caro's statistics, it can be overwhelming and it can feel hopeless, but we can all take small actions to help make this better. Like Liz said, there's a petition at the back of the room that you all can sign if you're in favor of recognizing freedom from domestic violence as a human right. And we're hoping to do that before the legislature so that they know that there is support from the Ithaca and Tompkins County community. So if you are equipped to do so, please do. Thank you, Liz.
I'm Kristi Taylor. I am one of the education staff with the Advocacy Center. We're based out of Ithaca, and we provide advocacy, crisis intervention, and ongoing supportive services to survivors of domestic violence, also sexual violence and child sexual abuse or sexual assault. And we provide those services throughout the entire Tompkins County, including 2 campuses as students, faculty, staff who may experience those forms of abuse. We really signed on to this because it's obviously, we've heard so much. The reframing helps to give some better language. The messaging can be really strong and really powerful for the community, but also survivors. And I want to bring it back to part of my work since I've been doing this has really been to work directly with survivors and specifically survivors of domestic violence. And one of the things that is such a common statement that you hear or feeling that is communicated is just the fact of, am I going to be believed? Am I going to be supported? Will my community, the court systems, the criminal justice system as a whole, and friends and family, will they allow me to tell my story and take it in and let me make my own decisions and recognize how many facets of my life this has actually impacted without judgment? And I think we still really struggle with that as a culture, and we still look at the individual person who's experienced the abuse or violence and start picking them apart as there's something different about them. There's something that they have done or created. Josh brought up the Ray Rice situation, and that is something that has just been rampant in that conversation, is what is it about his wife that she did or didn't do. And that's because we're still looking at these as individual circumstances and not as a holistic issue within our society, within our culture, within our world. And so I think if we can start pulling that out and we can have that conversation more openly and freely, one, it helps move the conversation along to try and put some real protections in place for survivors and safety, but also it gives the possibility for some people to reframe for themselves what this experience was for them, and hopefully pull it away from something that they did or caused or that's different or unique about them, and look at it as, I'm actually not unique in this experience. It's that I just live in this culture, this society that supports domestic violence to continue to happen, either by blaming victims or by not taking active steps to try and address the issue. So we really wanted to sign on for that. Tompkins County also really has been at the forefront with some of this work since their inception. The advocacy started as the Task Force for Battered Women in 1977, and it started as a group of volunteers who came together really because there was a need identified. The crisis hotline, the suicide prevention services in Tompkins County recognized that they were getting a substantial number of calls to their hotline from domestic violence victims who literally had no place to go and didn't know what to do, where to go. There wasn't necessarily a name for what they were experiencing either. People just said this was, something that you deal with in relationships. And so, there was a woman who was working there at the time who really recognized that this is a need, and she talked to a friend who was a therapist that was recognizing this, and then it was, let's get together and talk about what we can do. And from there, that's how this really started here. It has grown and developed over time. But one of the things that's really amazing is we also have a multidisciplinary team in Tompkins County, which are incredibly common now. We started ours in the 80s, specifically around child sexual abuse, and that was something that was unheard of at the time. And it was representatives of law enforcement, child protective services, our advocacy organization, and basically for the purposes of coming together to really look at cases and circumstances and try to make sure that we were prosecuting them in the best way, but also supporting the survivors in the most efficient way possible. And started with child sexual abuse, we have also added domestic violence multidisciplinary team that both are still very active today. And that's something that's not completely unique to our area, but it does put us in this position to do some forward thinking and progress with what we're doing. So this could be a really powerful statement for Tompkins County to again kind of be that leader in how we view these issues. Thank you for having me.
So we'd like to open things up for discussion, but I just wanted to make a comment, I guess, and a bit of an introduction. I think we're so fortunate here to have folks from really throughout the community who have been at the forefront of addressing these issues, of thinking about these issues. We're so privileged to have the chance to work with Advocacy Center in Tompkins County. I understand that Judge James Kerrigan is here joining us from the Ithaca City Court Bench, where judges, of course, are so important to this endeavor. We also have colleagues from the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights who are with us. We have members of Finger Lakes Women's Bar Association here today. We have community members. Last night at a film screening we did on a related the issue of domestic violence. We had members of the Cornell Police. And so really there's so many allies, I think, who are part of our community, who really care about this issue, who are invested in it, who are committed to making a difference. And I think, as a human rights clinic, it's a really exciting opportunity for us because, we kind of think, okay, we're in law school, we're, adversarial, we're going to go out and fight. And of course you need to fight for justice, but sometimes you also need to think about, how can we collaborate? How can we bring people together and be a part of really a movement? And I think this is a really exciting movement because it's so deeply local, but it's also global, national, transnational. And I think to address a problem that's as complex and difficult and devastating as domestic violence, that's what you really need. You need lots of allies from lots of different sectors, lots of different approaches, globally, locally, coming together and thinking about solutions. So we're excited for this opportunity. I also just wanted to mention we have copies of our draft resolution, as well as a background paper that gives a little bit of context for it. Both are very much drafts, so we would welcome you to take a look, in addition to signing the petition, to giving us feedback and recommending areas you think that they could be improved. We welcome your partnership in all of this as well. So I'll turn things back to the panel and to all of you to ask any questions.
I've got two questions. One is, what would be the remedy? What remedy would be available to a person if there's this kind of recognition of a human right, an international human right, that isn't available now? So what would change about that? And then the other question is, what's the argument against doing this? This isn't a law school exam. Just a question, two questions.
I can tackle the second one about the argument against, just because I've done not a lot of, but some community outreach. There has been a little bit of pushback. I think one thing is people kind of feel like, well, not everything is a human right. You can't just say everything is a human right. And they seem to forget that, and these same people see freedom from violence as a human right, but then for some reason changing it to domestic violence. I think it goes back to the whole idea of domestic violence being a more private thing, something that's dealt with in the family, and they might see government intrusion on that as something that's not appropriate. And so I've talked to people who have said, well, I don't think that's a human right. That doesn't sound like a human right to me. Almost going back to that whole private-public distinction.
Thanks.
I feel like, I'm trying to tackle the first question. I feel like one of the pieces where this can, I don't know if it would in and of itself create an additional remedy for survivors or additional services. I think it's really a step in a process. Part of the draft resolution is naming it, putting the language, and also really recommendations and a call to action for the community itself to start looking at their own policies, their own procedures, and their own how they address or experience domestic violence in their work. And so I think it starts to have that thought process happening. So I don't think a resolution alone is going to solve the problem. But I think we have to have that initial step to be able to then go forward and look at, okay, now where are the actual practical remedies that can come out of this? Does this open up other doors? Are some people who weren't willing to have that conversation when it was considered more of a private family, or this doesn't impact me, are they now willing to come to the table and have that conversation so that we can start looking at it? Because I really make the argument that regardless of what your agency or entity does, you have a role in addressing domestic violence where it impacts you. I mean, even just thinking about in a financial sector, the amount of lost wages, healthcare expenses, mental health services, and also social services that are expended that can really be linked back to trauma and domestic violence is really out of control. The numbers, that's my very nice way of saying that, they're incredibly high. And so sometimes that's what it takes for people to look at it, is they want to see the financial impacts. But I think this could also be a step of engaging some different conversations, at least in a new way, for different agencies or different individuals.
Thank you.
Is there any past precedent of individual municipalities declaring things as human rights?
12 previous communities have, including Albany, Boston.
I mean, any other right?
I'm sorry?
I mean, any other right?
Any other, all besides
Domestic violence.
Domestic violence. Not sure.
Lots of municipalities supplement state or federal human rights laws with their own protections. For example, Tompkins County in the early 90s and also in the early 2000s incorporated sexual orientation and gender identity and expression protections for employment, housing, before the state did that. So a lot of people use it to supplement existing protections.
Okay, thank you.
use that in terms of why it's important and why the first step is very important. Many people who have been victims of domestic abuse and violence don't really know that that's what's happening to them, particularly if they married young and if they're upscale. And there's a book that was written by by a Cornell professor that I pulled off the shelf in 2006, which I commend you to read, and it's called Not to People Like Us, Hidden Abuse in Upscale Marriages. So it's very important to realize that this is not just someone who's blue collar, someone who comes home at night after doing manual labor and beats up his wife. There are very, very charismatic, very highly intelligent, high-functioning people who inflict a lot of damage on their spouses, and no one is really immune. So I think that the recognition of it is quite important.
I think that's great, and our agency actually has a small lending library that we use for professionals as well as individuals using our services, and that happens to be one of the resources
Yes.
that we provide because, looking, obviously with confidentiality, we don't disclose specifics of who's utilizing our services, but it is really a cross-section of the community. There are people from all different backgrounds, levels, identities, universities. It really, we see that within our community. It's not unique. So.
I have two things also. First, I was just wondering if maybe you could share your thoughts about what kind of terminology we use to talk about this issue, whether it be domestic violence or intimate partner violence or relationship violence. And then second, I just wanted to know for people who couldn't make it here today, if there will be additional opportunities around the school for other students or faculty or staff to sign the petition.
Well, I could answer your first question. One of the reasons I think we decided to sort of focus on domestic violence rather than intimate partner violence is because domestic violence also includes violence against children in a relationship. So if we say intimate partner violence, we might be excluding them. However, in our background paper, we do state that we describe it as domestic violence and also include it as intimate partner violence.
I think another big part of it is that domestic violence is just the term that's most easily understood. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and it just seems like when you start introducing completely new terminology, that might muddy the issue, and especially with the first step, we wanted to be very clear about what we're speaking about. But like Cara said, spent a few good meetings discussing which term we were using and why, so it was a really good question. As to your second, sorry.
I was going to say, well, language is something, I do education work around this, so language is a conversation we have a lot. And it's really interesting when you talk to survivors about the language that they choose to use to identify for themselves as well. From our agency, we philosophically come from a place of reflecting back the language that somebody is utilizing if we're working with someone. We have individuals who really identify with the word victim. They feel like that is what their experience has been, and that is what most aptly describes how they felt. And people who really reject that and identify as survivors. So I really encourage people to, if you are working with somebody or in your future work, reflect back the language that they're utilizing, because they get to make that determination for themselves. And also just a good kind of practice in general, regardless of the issue that you're dealing with, is person-first language. So a person who has experienced domestic violence, a child who has been sexually abused, as opposed to a child sexual abuse victim or a domestic violence victim. Is there a human being first, and then this is an experience that has happened to them or that they have had, which I think is really powerful in allowing people to identify or kind of work through the process of how they integrate that into their life. So that's my other piece of language.
As to your second question, we are hoping on rolling out online petitions soon, which we think will be a lot easier to access, especially Cornell students. But there has been something really great about having a physical petition as well, because it opens a lot of conversations that you can't necessarily have when you're just sharing it online. So that will be with us.
I was just wondering if, as you've been advocating for this, your conversations with survivors and what their thoughts on it are, and also if you've involved, I know sometimes with domestic violence, in terms of the criminal context, sometimes survivors can, not want to talk about it or not accept what happened, and just kind of, or even if it's like don't even want to like testify, or in terms of like the criminal context. I wonder if you've thought about that at all, and how you can get involved and educate people, and that that doesn't happen.
I think there's a few pieces to what you're bringing up there. As far as having this conversation so far with survivors, I don't know if we've had the opportunity to do that. As far as using language of human rights violation, it is definitely something that we can talk about more, because I fully support that. And just hearing from people instead of, sometimes we can get too heady and too macro and above it, and not actually, and assume that this is something that's really helpful on that ground level. So we do have some opportunities to explore that and do that. I think on the other piece, as far as, how do we do that education, how do we work with survivors, especially within the criminal justice system, it can be a really daunting process for survivors. It's something that those coordinated community responses, and as a whole, the government recognizes this locally, and then other agencies that are involved start recognizing this. That's that piece of examining what are the barriers for survivors. Why is it challenging for people to come forward and go through the criminal justice process or testify? And are there things that we can do in a more efficient manner, working together to reduce those barriers and to increase people's safety? Actually, there was a film screening last night, and it followed the story of a woman, domestic homicide, and the narrator, who's an investigator, and I believe she may have gone back and is doing prosecutions now. She talks about the language that she uses around victims and not testifying, and what she will say is that a victim was not able to testify, and she goes back and explains that and says that she'll never use the phrase that a victim will not testify, because she really looks at it from a more holistic factor of, if we could guarantee safety for a victim if they go through that process and testify, and that the outcome will be better for them than what they have learned to survive with now, then she really believes that victims would testify more frequently. And I think that is kind of a larger piece, is how are our systems set up, what are the laws that are in place, and how can we best support survivors. So I think this can be a first step to that, because then we can continue to have those conversations that are always happening. But how do we implement some of that work?
So I was wondering if you all who are in the clinic could just talk a little bit about, what insights this work has brought to your experiences as human rights advocates, as clinic students, and especially I know Carolyn and Joanne participated in the clinic last semester doing quite different work in a quite different place. And so what has this sort of blend of local and global brought to your understanding, either of the issue of violence against women, or of gender-based violence, or to your understanding of human rights advocacy?
I have not done any work like this previously. I did know there was an international movement to make freedom from domestic violence right at all. I didn't really know anything about domestic violence. So I guess the biggest thing for me is just actually learning about the issue, learning about advocacy, and everything like that.
I think for me, so like Liz was saying, Carolyn and I went to Nepal last semester and we worked on women's reproductive rights. Sometimes it's easy to think, oh, human rights is another issue. It's happening elsewhere and we should really help with that, as opposed to thinking there are human rights violations happening here and we should tackle that really with the same force, if not more force. And it's been great to have both of those experiences and to kind of reflect and compare and realize that human rights is a continuous thread regardless of where you are in the world, and there's always something to fight against.
I think piggybacking off what Joanne said, last semester we felt a little more removed from the work we were doing, I think, until we got to Nepal and we were able to present some of the research we had done on the issues we were working on. But this semester we're really going out there into the community. We are working in a very, very quick deadlines. We're working together. We're working with people in the community and we're having face-to-face meetings, which is great because I think that's definitely helping us build different skills for advocacy and just general lawyering. So I've really enjoyed it. And I remember also last semester in our clinic class, we had a session where we talked about why should U.S. students be focused on international human rights. And by us being involved in this project, we are making sure that human rights in the U.S. are where they need to be. So that's something I really, really enjoyed.
While I fully support this campaign to recognize domestic violence as a human rights issue, there are certain things that I want to say give me some pause as to whether we're really on the right track. So I guess the question that I want to ask is how much of this domestic violence issue is really an enforcement issue? So we should be addressing enforcement instead of adding on another layer of rhetoric.
Sorry, can you clarify the question a little bit? So are you saying that as opposed to doing a resolution, it should really
As
be
opposed
training?
to focusing on adding another layer of rhetoric, because sometimes when we classify things as a human right, everybody gets so excited, and we see it on the international scales, because everyone gets so excited and really emotional behind it, but there's no enforcement. And I think should we be focusing more on addressing enforcement issues as opposed to classifying as a human right? Would that be more effective to address the enforcement? Yes, is what I'm saying.
I can try to tackle that. That's a good question. I think, like we've been saying, this is not the only step, but I do think it's important to have a foundational premise from which we then go on to do things. So for example, we have a recommendation section on our resolution. And one of the recommendations is that we're asking the legislature to look at gaps in policies and to see how it might conflict with the fact that freedom from domestic violence is a human right. So that includes service to domestic violence, survivors of domestic violence, and that becomes the resolution then becomes a vehicle from which the government can operate. So I don't think those are mutually exclusive options. I think that one can help inform the other. But I do think it's an important question to ask about the different methods. Sorry, did you have something?
Yeah, as a follow-up, I think what I'm thinking of is that, for example, when we watched the documentary yesterday, and the victim went to the police station and filed a protective order, and later withdrew the protective order when her husband appeared next to her in court, and her husband was threatening her, saying that you need to retract these statements and tell the judge to give your guns back. And once she didn't realize the legal consequences of once she does that, what will happen. And I think the problem is that there is nothing really that the law can do unless the victim, because the victim is paralyzed. There's nothing that the law can do unless the victim comes forward and definitively and is consistent with her story. And I think we need to work on changing the laws around that, like recognizing issues of coercion, and even though despite the fact that the victim is scared and the victim is saying everything's okay, it's sort of a paternalistic argument. I think we need a law that's sort of gonna override that and look at the victim's concern, future concern, as opposed to her immediate concern.
I think there's a lot of, when you're addressing these issues, and I don't know if anybody looks at public health models or things of that nature, in our education work, we utilize the socio-ecological model, so really looking at the different layers of the work that you're doing and the advocacy that you're doing. So there's the individual work, so with an individual survivor, how are we providing support services and prevention work and education? And then we also, at the same time, need to be looking at the community level and then the larger societal level. And I think this is a piece that falls into that larger spectrum of the advocacy work. And it needs to be also done in conjunction with the systems. So whether we're talking about social services systems, criminal justice systems, we still need to be doing that work between the individual. It all really needs to be happening in concert, because if you only focus in one place, the systems advocacy, for example, what you're speaking about, that's something that has been done for a lot of years in this work, and there has been progress, but that by itself isn't going to address the larger issue. And so I agree with everything you're saying. And I think this can also be a piece that's just in that larger community societal level as well. So they can all happen simultaneously. And I think this is a piece, we've done a lot of individual work, we've done a lot of systems work. We haven't done a lot of really large scale societal community work. Not necessarily our agency as a whole, we're really working on that, but as a culture. And that's where we've fallen down a bit. So I think this can start to address that component well.
Hi, going back to your comment, I think that it is important to label freedom from domestic violence as a human right, and not just focus on enforcement. Why? Enforcement is always ex post, so it's a remedy. And labeling freedom from domestic violence as a human right can actually help ex ante, so it could be more of a preventive measure. We all know that it's a subset of the existing human rights. We're not creating a right that doesn't exist. There's a right to life, there's a right to dignity. This is purely a subset of the existing rights. But it's an important subset, and it's important that we create awareness to it for its preventive power, not just to further existing remedies, but to create awareness that will help. And going back to what you said, unfortunately, this is mainly a private issue. It happens in a very small subset, which is a very small unit, which is the family. And how can we as a society help create safeguards in such a small and intimate group? Well, again, I think the only way to do that is through awareness, and especially through education, and especially at a very young age. So my recommendation, or my thoughts is, for this to work, I think we need to start or target. Target is probably a bad word, but we should consider measures or awareness campaigns at a very, very young age, because that's when people should get the idea that certain intimate violences, and not just domestic, but also sexual violence, is not acceptable, and it's gender neutral. Just to add. Thank you. Sorry, that wasn't really a question. It was just
Very well spoken.
Yes.
I just want to add one more thing. That at a very local level, and this is in sort of what you're saying, without being too personal, I had reached a decision that if I ever witnessed or saw what I considered to be abuse, I would say something or do something regarding the meeting. And this is something, I have never called the police on anybody in my life, but you know, in Ithaca, I woke up, I heard, you know, prolonged screaming both ways, male, female voices. I just went to the phone, I called 911, I said that this is what I'm hearing. I do not know what is happening, and I do not know who is, whether they're committing violence on each other or one to the other. But I said, I think you should try to go over there. And they went, the police were there almost immediately. And so, you know, I think that most of, in America, I mean, I had spent most of my life, and I'm a lawyer, I'm an advocate, but basically viewing these things as private. If I heard a couple really fighting in their own home, I wouldn't think to have called. But I woke up and I did that, and in the morning, my gentleman friend, who I'm with now, he said that what I said was, I'm not going to let, and I gave my former husband's name, do that to anyone else. I mean, in my sleep, I mean, that's basically. So it has, you know, you can make a decision even without having gone through the drama yourself, that it is abusive and it is violent for people to scream at one another and use harsh language, really harsh language, and put them in bodily fear. You know, it's an assault, I mean, fear of harm. So I think that for your work, that because you're working again within a culture that is so, you know, reserved in terms of intervening in other people's problems, public information is very important.
Well, I think we're about at the end of our time, so please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you all.